Okay, I think I'm going to get us started for today. First, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today in this webinar. We're about to have a very timely and thoughtful conversation around the greenhouse gas protocol's open public consultations. We're going to go into a much more detail, but there are two open public comment periods right now. The first covers the proposed revisions to the Scope 2 guidance, and the second is seeking feedback to inform the development of consequential methods for reporting emissions outside of corporate inventories. Today marks what I believe is the 24th day of that 60-day comment period. All submissions must be submitted by December 19th, 2025. So today we're going to bring stakeholders up to speed, provide an overview of the process, and then give some ideas for resources so that you can engage in this process. I want to thank Michael Macrae for joining me today, the Director of Scope 2 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and some of his colleagues are on the line as well, as are some of mine at CEBA. Before I turn it over to Michael, I just want to give a couple of points from CEBA's perspective. The first is just the incredible importance of the protocol Scope 2 guidance and this revision process. And so that leads directly into number two, which is that we want to see all stakeholders engage in this process to help shape the final outcome. From CEBA's perspective, the Scope 2 guidance has been extremely successful. It has provided an incentive for corporate leadership around clean energy procurement. As many of you know, corporates have committed to over 120 gigawatts of large-scale clean energy since 2014. That represents about 40% of the clean energy capacity added during that time. So I just want to, again, sort of underline or underscore how important that is. And so we share a common goal, CEBA and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that impact continue, and that's why your voice matters, and we're here today. So let me turn it over to Michael. He is going to walk through the process and the open consultations, and then we will address some questions that have come in already through the process after that. And then at the very end, we'll close out and share some additional resources to help everybody respond to these two open surveys. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
I will continue the thank yous, Misty, with a big thank you to CEBA for helping organize this, pull together everybody who's joined us online. A big thank you to all of you who are taking the times out of what we know and appreciate our very busy schedules these days. So a deep heartfelt thanks to everybody for joining us today, and a big shout out thank you to our internal GHG Protocol comms team for all the support also in making this come together. So really excited to walk through a number of items related to the Scope 2 consultation and the electricity sector consultation. As we've shared before in a previous GHG Protocol webinar, which I'm going to pull a lot of material from that today, but also try and provide some new insight as well as targeted focus onto key material. So there are two consultations open right now. Let's start with that just to make sure that we're all orienting ourselves appropriately, correctly, understanding really what the opportunity is here for stakeholder engagement. Starting at the top, the Scope 2 inventory consultation is focused on updates to the 2015 published Scope 2 guidance. This consultation is focused on updating the Scope 2 standards and guidance, the methodology that will be part of an updated overall corporate standard as part of the suite of corporate standard updates. So it'll sit right alongside Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 in that updated corporate standard. The goal here with this consultation is keeping focused on inventory accounting and ensuring that the Scope 2 guidance, the Scope 2 standard, continues to be fit for purpose by providing critical updates to both the location and market-based methods. Equally important here, part of the parallel process, is the electricity sector consequential methods. In this consultation, it is focusing primarily on avoided emission methodologies, some of the key and critical details that we have to get right to enable a bigger, broader, more comprehensive framework that uses these kinds and types of consequential methodologies to calculate the impacts of avoided emissions, of procurements, of all kinds and types of actions organizations may and do take across the electric sector. The goal with this consultation on the electric sector consequential methods, again, is to gather a lot of impact, a lot of feedback to accelerate and enable that process to happen as swiftly as possible, and under the direction and guidance under a common framework established by the Actions Market Instruments Technical Working Group. I'm going to say AMI a lot instead of Actions Market Instruments because that's a mouthful. But the AMI TWG Technical Working Group is focused on developing a broader, more comprehensive sector agnostic framework into which the electric sector and related sectors can then fit so that we have a comprehensive fit for purpose accounting framework. So those are our two parallel consultations. Again, scope 2 focusing on inventory accounting, and the electric sector consequential methods focusing on exactly that, consequential methods to help accelerate and enable the AMI's framework for that topic. As Misti mentioned, all feedback on either or both of these surveys has to come through the formal consultation process. I love having conversations with as many people as are willing to do so. But at this point in time, if you want your voice to be part of this process, we really have to have it come in through the consultation process. That's the only way that we can ensure a transparent, equitable process for all interested stakeholders. So please use that channel accordingly. Before we get into the actual technical content, I do want to at least run through briefly our governance and standard development revision process. I suspect a lot of people here may be more familiar with the technical content and less familiar with our governance structure, but this is critical and key to enabling a appropriate, accurate, equitable, fair process. So I just want to provide a quick orientation on GHG Protocol's multi-governance or multi-stakeholder governance structure. The sort of core guiding principle here is we did a lot of work to make sure this is based on best practice for standard setters to ensure transparency, integrity, and inclusiveness. The governance structure consists of several governance and advisory bodies. There's the co-hosts, which include the World Resource Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They oversee the Secretariat staff. They provide legal support and financial oversight for this entire work. The steering committee provides strategic guidance on the goals and direction of the GHG Protocol. The Independent Standards Board, which I'll refer to frequently as the ISB, Independent Standards Board, ISB, oversees the standard development process, and this is the body, the ISB approves the final content of the standards. They are the decision-making body, they are the final approving body. The GHG Protocol Secretariat, where I and my team and many others on the GHG Protocol staff sit, executes daily management support services, including things outside of this type of revision work, like our e-learning programs, as well as this standard development activity. Our technical working groups, one of the most critical bodies in this entire graphic, is the body that provides the expert input on specific topics, issues, et cetera, under consideration in a given standard or revision process. And then lastly, there's also a donor council, which facilitates transparent communication between our steering committee and donors. But I really want to emphasize this, they play no role, zero role in the actual standard setting process. All of our work is now being developed under this process. This will include both consultations as well as for any future work, global surveys. And just as a quick metric, right now, we think we have, last time I checked, about 200 technical working group members engaged in our standard update process across all the different work streams. So there's a lot going on. And again, critically, this is a sort of bottoms up approach to say, work with technical working groups, guide the work based on public consultation surveys. For scope 2 example, we did that as concluding in 2023. So bringing this back to scope 2, this consultation really reflects GHG Protocol's process where we're striving to have a rigorous, transparent flow and process where we involve technical review as well as inputs from businesses, government, academia, civil society, really everybody. When we look at the actual process and sort of step sequence associated with this, our mission is again focused on developing a credible, accessible, and widely adopted greenhouse gas reporting standard. as I mentioned before, but really want to emphasize, because I think a lot of times there's a focus only on one standard at a time. We are currently updating the corporate standard published in 2004, the Scope 3 standard published in 2011, the Scope 3 calculation guidance published in 2013, and the Scope 2 guidance published in 2015. In parallel, we are also developing a new actions market instrument standard. And then I think it's also worth noting here, as recently announced, we're developing a new product carbon accounting standard as part of GHG Protocol's partnership with ISO. And so there's multiple different work streams under development here. These are all proceeding under a common set of steps and sequences as outlined in our standard development and revision procedure. If you're interested, that document's available on our website. I won't belabor the specific points here, but we have gone through for Scope 2 the preparation that included defining the objective, some of the survey work, development and revision process, including almost 20 meetings with technical working group over the last year to develop the revision proposal out for consultation. We are now in that top right box, public consultation. That's this process. That's the focus now. Following that, we'll synthesize all the feedback, work with the technical working group and ISB towards that approval, ratification, publication, et cetera, through that process. As part of how we think of engaging in the consultation, I want everybody to take at least a moment here, if not longer, to review what GHG Protocol calls the decision-making criteria. This is also established as a hierarchy. This is the tool, the resource that we've used throughout all the technical working group processes to ensure appropriate development and comparison between different concepts, different ideas, different questions, different considerations. These criteria are designed to ensure a balance between environmental integrity, technical rigor, practicality, and global relevance. And so we generally follow the pathway you see on the screen here, but we want to stress that all of the criteria are important, and we strive to meet all of these criteria. Of course, there's going to be periods and times where there's trade-off in these criteria, and in those instances, our goal is to carefully evaluate the implications of all of those trade-offs to find optimal solutions. We recognize companies rely on the GHG Protocol standards and guidance for their emission accounting, disclosures, target setting, and that having up-to-date standards reflective of the latest scientific and technical developments is of the utmost importance in achieving these. And so that's part of why we put those at the top of the hierarchy to work through this process. As a point of engagement, last thing before we get into the technical content, I want to reiterate and re-outline the conditions or provisions provided for anonymity and confidentiality in stakeholder feedback through the consultation. So I'll start with and end with all of the feedback submitted is to be publicly available. Transparency, accountability, and representation from stakeholders is absolutely critical, foundational to GHG Protocol standard development process. It always has been. So as such, all of the feedback that we will base any changes, any updates, any modifications to the proposed revisions similarly need to be transparently and accountably represented so that we all understand where any proposed changes, modifications, et cetera, come from. As such, all feedback submitted during this consultation process will be made publicly available. That said, in exceptional circumstances, we do recognize public attribution may prohibit or challenge organizations' ability to participate. And so you have an option to explicitly opt into public anonymity by checking the appropriate box in the feedback form. If that doesn't make sense to you, I encourage you to actually go to the website, play around with the actual submission process, find that box, understand what it looks like. When you select that box, your name, your organizational affiliation, and your country will be redacted. Your sector type and the sort of broad continental location of your organization, that will still be included to help put into perspective any of the feedback. Please, please, please be aware, we, GHG Protocol, will not be redacting, modifying, reviewing, editing any of anyone's feedback to redact or otherwise hide information you might provide about your organization. So if you select to be anonymous, but then put identifiable information into your responses, that's a decision that you need to make and evaluate. It's the responsibility of the respondent to ensure all feedback does not contain any identifiable information. We also have a very narrow confidentiality exception for any commercially sensitive data, pre-publication research, et cetera, that might be submitted in support of, but not in lieu of, any feedback that is otherwise subject to public disclosure. These requests we anticipate being infrequent. They will be subject to review and not necessarily guaranteed, so we encourage every organization to request that as soon as possible and before you submit your consultation. To help ensure that process runs smoothly, we ask everybody to submit their request by or before December 1st to allow sufficient time. And if you have any questions on our governance structure, procedures, policies, et cetera, please refer to the consultation materials for any relevant links. And you can always visit our governance portion of the website for any additional information. So with that, let's get into the GHG protocol inventory consultation. And starting with why are we updating the standard? We've presented this in our previous webinar, so I'm going to try and go through it pretty quickly, but want to make sure that we at least understand, what has brought us together here. So Scope 2 guidance, hopefully we all remember, published in 2015, and a lot has changed since then. GHG protocol, and I think all of us have observed electricity markets become significantly more dynamic. There's a lot more renewable technologies being deployed. They're much more common. And importantly, critically, GHG protocol standards are now used in regulatory and investor disclosure programs. That is a critical point that I want to continue to reemphasize as how we think about the use, the deployment, and the design of GHG protocol standards. There's an added use that is regularly being adopted for the standards. This is that adoption and use under regulatory and investor disclosure programs. As such, this creates a much stronger need and drive to create more accurate, more comparable, and decision-useful data to support these target setting programs, as well as mandatory and investor grade reporting. A lot of different concerns have been raised about the 2015 guidance. We got a lot of feedback on this. There were a lot of organizations who all came to us saying, it's helpful, it's encouraging, it has, as Misti said, driven development, but it needs to be updated. We heard that from almost every single stakeholder who engaged with us, that updates are needed, that updates are relevant, that updates are timely and appropriate. And I think with any standard, 10 years is a sufficient length of time to then revisit and reevaluate. So all the proposed updates aim to strengthen Scope 2 inventories, keeping them decision useful, and ensuring that they provide more comparable reporting data that can be used across these target setting programs, mandatory disclosures, investor frameworks, et cetera, while also staying grounded in GHG protocol accounting principles. As we think about these two parallel consultations, again, just to reiterate, Scope 2 is an inventory methodology similar to Scope 1 and Scope 3. It uses attributional approaches to allocate emissions, all of the emissions that have happened in a given reporting period, within a defined organizational operational boundary. In contrast, the other parallel consultation is looking at consequential approaches. These use system-wide impacts relative to counterfactual baselines, and critically, as reiterated by the ISB, these approaches need to remain separate. They report, capture, provide both critical information, but they are separate and different sets of information. The structure of the consultation is divided into multiple sections. We first introduce definitions and purposes. Sections 4 and 5 then focus on the location-based and market-based methods. Sections 6 and 7 dive into some of the exemptions proposed for feasibility considerations, followed by legacy clause and other transition tools. Critically, I do want to emphasize that you don't need to answer every question. There's a lot of specific things that dig into areas that we know are important to some, but maybe not all stakeholders, and we need to investigate all of these areas. But we also recognize some areas, some questions, some context may be different or outside of an entity or organization's familiarity, and so it is perfectly acceptable to skip some of those questions. Let's get into the actual content, the actual Scope 2 standard material. I'm going to start at the top and say one of the key things everybody to be aware of is the structure of the updates the structure of the Scope 2 standard remains the same, and that's the dual reporting framework. As in the 2015 guidance, every organization everywhere globally is required to report a location-based method Scope 2 inventory. Similar to 2015's guidance, every organization who has operations, load, presence in markets with consumer choice, the ability for differentiated supply, also is required to report the market-based method. In 2015, one of those was much larger than the other, but I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a significant increase in the number of markets where the market-based method does become applicable and appropriate. And so increasingly, most organizations will be required to report both the location-based and the market-based method for their Scope 2 inventory. I'll go through these in detail in subsequent slides, but just to hit the high notes here, location-based focuses on 3 primary updates. There's an updated hierarchy. There's a requirement using that hierarchy to report with the most precise location-based emission factor accessible, for which there's also activity data available, and a definition of accessible that's publicly available, free to use, and from a credible source. So those are the 3 primary updates for the location-based method. Within the market-based method, you have an update focused on the quality criteria for time matching. This moves organizations above a threshold to require hourly matching when they make voluntary claims. It's not hourly matching for everything. It's if and when organizations want to make voluntary matching claims. There's a deliverability requirement, requires that all certificates, all emission data is sourced from generation that is deemed deliverable. Scope 2's definition is purchased and consumed electricity, more than just purchased electricity, it's purchased and consumed electricity. Deliverability and hourly matching, moving Scope 2 back towards that anchor definition of purchased and consumed electricity. There's increased clarification and guidance related to a concept called standard supply service. This guidance and requirement is to help understand how organizations getting different supply should account for and report for that. We've heard a lot of feedback that there's different ways, different order of operations that entities might apply this type of information. And so this is seeking to establish singular clarity in how to work through that application, how to work through that information, and also to ensure that entities are not claiming more than their pro rata share of what should be fairly allocated to all consumers under this standard supply concept. Last item on the market-based update list is the updated definitions for residual mix. And that is that where there's no specific published residual mix data available, instead of using an average, which includes a lot of generation other organizations are counting in their market-based method, this directs reporting entities to use a fossil-only rate with a couple different provisions for how to do that. So those are the primary updates for the location market-based method. There's also some implementation measures equally important, focused on feasibility. I'm going to go over these in subsequent slides, but again, to hit the high notes, load profiles provide a means to translate annual or monthly data into hourly data. I get it. We've all worked in energy utility space a lot. Hourly data is not necessarily something available to every organization. But if you're doing a Scope 2 inventory, presumably you have monthly or at least annual data. A load profile allows you to use the exact same information that you use to report today to report under an hourly matching requirement. So you could use the exact same data that you have today with significantly increased accuracy to report under an hourly matching requirement. Exemption thresholds provide provisions for organizations under some exemption threshold to still report using either monthly or annual data. So we recognize that for a lot of organizations, there is a burden associated with reporting, and the consultation seeks to understand what's the appropriate threshold that we should allow smaller or even medium-sized organizations to be exempt from some of these more accurate, more comparable reporting requirements. A legacy clause, as well as other transition tools, similarly being considered to recognize there are a lot of contracts, there are a lot of investments that have been made, and we need to understand how to appropriately account for those going forward. It's a very critical point, and I want to emphasize and stress the importance of everybody's feedback and really to make sure that you understand both perspectives presented in the consultation on the legacy clause to ensure that we can make the best decisions with the technical working group, the independent standards board, et cetera, going forward. Last, but certainly not least, a phased implementation. And so I think there's sometimes some concern that, well, the market today, tomorrow is not immediately ready necessarily for all of these changes. We recognize that. We appreciate that. We understand that. We understand the complexity associated with not only the process to do an organization's annual emissions inventory, but all of the associated pieces and parts that are related to that. And so a phased implementation is being considered to say, if GHG protocol concludes the corporate standard suite development end of 2027, the first plausible reporting year would be probably reporting year 2028, which means you would be doing this work in 2029, and perhaps some sort of phased implementation to give even more time than that could allow for significant further development associated with tools, resources, project planning, et cetera, related with any of the updates that are put into effect. And the gray box at the bottom, I'll continue to highlight that. Also, the parallel consultation related to avoided emissions, particularly focused on electricity sector actions, evaluating these with consequential methods. This is again designed to help support the actions market instruments, the AMI TWG, which is advancing a larger, broader, more comprehensive approach to say we need standardized sector agnostic requirements for quantifying and reporting impacts. And that could be consequential impacts, it could be a variety of different methods, but it's something that works in tandem, in parallel, in support, and alongside inventory disclosures. I think we've got maybe just under 10 minutes left that I'm going to use to further unpack specific details related to both location-based and market-based, and then hopefully we can switch over to some question and answer period. Assuming my computer cooperates in advance. There we go. So proposed revisions, location-based method. I mentioned a hierarchy. Unpacking that hierarchy just a little bit further, the hierarchy focuses first on looking at spatial boundaries. A local boundary, maybe an operational grid boundary, or if that data is unavailable, using grid-wide or even national boundaries. That's the first point of consideration that organizations are proposed to be using now as they evaluate their location-based emission factors. Following that, once you identify the spatial boundary for which you have emissions data, then look at the temporal granularity for that grid average factor, hourly, monthly, annual. Once you have that information, there's also an evaluation of, are you using consumption or production-based emissions factor? Does the information include imported power? In some regions, imports might be trivial, de minimis, non-existent. In other regions, imports might be a massive, significant portion of load. And so it's critically important to evaluate, assess, and understand that data as part of how organizations pick, define, and use location-based emission factors. This is something I think we've all heard a lot, summarized in our stakeholder survey. There was uncertainty, lack of clarity in the original 2015 guidance on how to work through that hierarchical process. Critically important, though, is this definition of accessible. Location-based is not mandating organizations go out and procure information that's not publicly available, free to use, and from a credible source. I'll note, however, we've been asked questions, why does this necessarily need to be free to use? What if there's a better data set that is available for a de minimis cost? That is one of the areas of feedback that we'd love to gather more information about, including any context or information that stakeholders may have on the availability of these data sets. Are they available? Are they not available? If they're not available, how long would it take to develop them? If they are available, are they publicly available? And are they free to use? And how credible is that source? Those are some of the critical questions that we want to learn more through this public consultation. As you put all that together, there's also, of course, the activity data. The emission factor multiplied by activity data equals location-based emissions. You might be able to find local boundary, hourly data using the right emission factor type for your region that is publicly available, free to use, and from a credible source, and only have annual data. In those instances, you would be able to, and it would be appropriate to continue to report using just simply an annual emissions factor with annual data. The activity data is critical to setting what the appropriate precision level is for location-based emission factor calculations. I'll touch on load profiles in the next slide, but to reiterate again, there is this phased implementation, also part of what would transition or facilitate a orderly transition for these updates to the location-based method. Load profiles is something we talked a lot about in the original webinar. There's more discussion in our technical working group slides and content. And also this is information that is broadly available and used by many different kinds and types of organization. They are designed to translate annual, monthly, even daily electricity consumption totals into hourly consumption estimates. And so you might understand, I know one number, my annual load, or maybe you get 12 monthly bills. Load profiles are a tool used by grid planners, grid operators, utilities, project developers, many kinds and types of organizations to translate what is a total number into expected load. This can provide significantly more accurate data when you think about aligning a claim of or reporting information associated with usage of electricity with what we all understand to be the dynamic production variation in the electric grid systems. I've already mentioned they exist from a variety of applications, can be freely downloaded, used in a lot of different kinds and types of sources. And critically, for location-based method, if an organization wishes to report using hourly data, they can use load profiles, but again, they're not obligated to do so. This enables the use of more granular, more precise data under location-based method, but again, it's not a requirement for use under that methodology. Flipping over to market-based method, hourly matching, again, I want to emphasize this is for voluntary claims and only for organizations that are above the defined exemption threshold. And so if you are reporting, say, using a residual mix number, that would not require hourly matching information. Deliverability, focused on this principle that grids do operate on defined systems. There is a limit to where a project that is generating electricity could plausibly deliver that electricity to. In the U.S. and in the EU, that current practice uses a different approach to defining market boundaries, whereas we recognize in a lot of other countries around the world, it is limited to a political border. At the very least, this creates a significant asymmetry between countries outside of the United States and the EU and the rest of the world for what they're allowed to claim, what they're allowed to report. This transition for a definition of deliverability based on this principle of sort of how grids operate, how grids deliver electricity, ensures that there's a more equitable, fair, comparable methodology for all organizations, as well as increasing the accuracy of what companies, what corporate greenhouse gas inventories represent when they describe their purchased and consumed electricity. Standard supply covers how organizations should account for and report their electricity coming from whether it's publicly funded, mandated, utility required procurements, and provides clarity on the order of operations associated with how to claim that kind and type of energy. This can include emissions from renewable energy generation resources, non-emitting resources, carbon-free emission or CFE, so it's called, but it could also include fossil generation. And what this does is designed to make sure that organizations can claim up to, but no more than their pro rata share of standard supply service. An update to the residual mix ensures that when there's no residual mix data available, that we're not double counting clean energy generation that other organizations have already claimed in their inventories by the use of fossil-only rates. Load profiles I already described, but the same thing applies here as it does with the location-based method. Exemption thresholds, we encourage everybody to review those sections in the consultation document. They're designed, again, to provide flexibility for organizations under a threshold, and we're seeking to make sure that we establish that threshold appropriately. Legacy clause, critically important, looking at either allowing existing contracts to continue to be accounted for or some other transition tool, perhaps a uniform effective date after which all of the rules treat every organization and all contracts similarly. There's a lot of different balancing considerations associated with those two parameters that we really need a lot more feedback on. And last, but again, critically not least, this phased implementation. I'm going to cover our consequential accounting pieces and then jump over to question and answer. So quickly, why are we doing this? This is a Scope 2 technical working group. We're focused on Scope 2, which is an inventory methodology. That said, we recognize the consequential accounting and related methods are critically valuable. They've been around and established for almost 20 years by GHG protocol, but also critically underutilized in corporate reporting, target setting frameworks, mandatory disclosures, et cetera. And this creates a big mismatch and disconnection between the value of these methodologies and their practical application use today. We heard loud and clear stakeholder concern, both in the 2023 global survey, as well as continued engagement through technical working groups and other channels, that there needs to be additional metric. We want to enable organizations to be able to reflect their electric sector decarbonization impacts, particularly when they're not captured within a value chain inventory. We want to recognize contributions from procurement strategies, such as things like non-deliverable power purchase agreements that would be currently accountable under the current Scope 2 framework, but under the proposed revisions may no longer qualify. ISB, the Independent Standards Board's feedback, reiterated the value of this. I think everybody is in broad agreement here that this is something critical and necessary. But the ISB also raised questions related to some of the key parameters for how to do these calculations, questions related to additionality design criteria, questions related to the specifics of the calculation approach, as well as details related to marginal emission rates. Those are the focus of what's included in this public consultation. There's questions across 4 different sections related to marginal emission rate, or MER, methodologies. There's questions related to the treatment of additionality. If we're going to claim something's an avoided emission, how do we establish that this action caused those emissions to be avoided or induced? Build an operating margin weighting approaches. There's a 2007 GHG protocol document that provides some information on this, but it's a starting point. It's not an ending point. And if we're going to see this deployed at scale, we really need to dial in the parameters of how to do this exactly right and easy, because it could be overly complex, burdensome, and that's going to produce the same outcomes that have led to under-adoption, underuse of these standards so far. So we want to make sure that we've got the right information, parameters, et cetera. Also, some questions related to emission factor formulas, take megawatt hour procurements times the appropriate marginal emission rate to equal some sort of emission impact measured in tons of GHG or CO2 equivalents avoided emissions. So public consultation focuses on these 4 questions. These 4 questions will then be used and fed into AMI, Actions Market Instruments, as their ongoing process moves forward to develop a larger framework that fits electricity alongside things like aviation, steel, cement, and every other commodity across the global spectrum, to ensure that there's a consistent, accurate framework that is something that can be easily adopted, used by target setting programs, mandatory disclosures, et cetera. So that's an overview of everything that is out for consultation. There's obviously a lot more to it than one could sprint through in a 30-minute overview, but maybe the best way to continue to focus in where people are interested is to transition over to some questions. So a big thank you again for CEBA for hosting this webinar, for everybody who's joined us today. And the last piece of a presentation from me would be, please subscribe to GHG Protocol's mailing list if you want to hear all the news, all the updates. You want to be informed of all the changes, all the consultations, everything. Please go to ghgprotocol.org/subscribe to join our email list. So thank you again. Misti, Marcus, back over to both of you.
Thank you, Michael. With that overview of the different revisions, let's turn to a couple of questions, as Michael was saying. We have collected a couple of questions that have come through in the past, and we're about to flash those on screen. I'm not sure, Michael, if you need to stop sharing, and then Carrie is about to pull up her screen. Thank you. So a first question that came up a couple of times was, can an organization submit more than one online survey?
Can an organization submit more than one online survey? Each respondent, whether you're responding as an organization or an individual, can submit one official response through that consultation form. If an organization submits a response, individuals may also submit their own responses in their own personal capacity. Those will be reported separately. Both are going to be accepted, but they clearly need to differentiate between individual capacity and sort of an official organization. If an organization or an individual submitting more than one response, that creates some challenges. GHG protocol is going to reserve the right here to merge or remove multiple duplicative, et cetera, submissions from the same respondent in that consultation data set. We do want to highlight the consultation form structured so as to allow detailed input across multiple questions, open comment boxes, et cetera. So there's plenty of space for all perspectives to be captured effectively within one single submission from one single organization. But we really need to do this to maintain fairness, transparency, efficiency, and so all feedback needs to be submitted through that official form by one and only one submission from an individual and organization. We really want to make sure everybody's voice is heard and keep the process balanced, manageable, and transparent for everybody. So one submission.
Thank you. For our next question, you mentioned that there's different options how people can submit the responses. So one question was about how soon will the Greenhouse Gas Protocol decide on requests for confidentiality?
Confidentiality, yeah. So as I mentioned in the presentation, full transparency, the default option, that's every organization. If you are submitting, you will have a consultation response that is posted fully and transparently. If for whatever reason that posting with attribution is prohibiting an organization, you asked about confidentiality, but just to make sure, there's also an anonymity option. So somebody who wants to propose or post but just doesn't want their name on it, that's an option that you can do when completing the demographic portion. Again, that redacts just simply the name, the affiliation, and the country. So that's the anonymous option. Your question here is specific about confidentiality. That's expected to be significantly more rare than anyone who might select anonymity, and really only applies in probably a highly limited number of cases, such as commercially sensitive data. If somebody has unpublished research that they're not able to share yet transparently and openly, that would be something that might be considered under the confidentiality provision. So we've asked everybody to submit if you want to provide confidential data by November 30th. This guarantees that we have sufficient time to review before the consultation would close on the 19th of December. So maybe just to walk through, because I think this might also help sort of answer, clarify some people's confusion. One, please go actually look at the consultation process because it provides a specific overview of how to do this and what's involved. But succinctly, process I think is pretty straightforward. The request itself is only a few minutes at most to complete. We ask some very basic questions, plus a request for a very short explanation of what it is that the organization wants to keep confidential and why. Any organization that's doing this will still need to submit a public version of their feedback. So this shouldn't preclude anybody from filling out the questionnaire or slow things down at all. It's only would be this question about a narrow scope of what would be provided confidentiality. So everything's still public in the full feedback form that would be submitted. This confidential information would only be something to supplement, but key again, not to replace public consultation. So once that comes in, we'll review that as promptly as we possibly can. The Secretariat evaluating those with the GHG protocol at large. And we'll follow up with any instructions for how to share that confidential information if that request is approved. Again, please don't share any confidential information until the request has been approved. We'll work as swiftly as we can in the order of all confidentiality requests received. So again, please review that early to identify if you think your organization or as an individual you need to use the confidentiality provision. But given how limited that exemption is and the scale and scope of it, we actually do expect relatively few cases and pretty timely turnaround. So again, our goal is upholding transparency and fairness, but we do want to accommodate legitimate confidentiality needs where they're truly necessary. But every organization is still filing and submitting a full consultation feedback form So these one does not necessarily preclude the ability to get started on the other. Focus on that larger consultation package while in parallel also submitting any confidentiality requests as soon as possible.
Thanks, Michael. My next two questions are concerning the situations where companies disagree with the overall direction of the revisions. So the first one is if a company does not support the hourly matching proposed requirements, how can they express alternative approaches?
Yeah. So maybe kind of just starting with, Scope 2 consultation at large is designed to gather clear and actionable feedback on the proposed updates to the location-based and market-based method. So each one of the sections within that document I walked through earlier is structured to include targeted questions. These questions are asking respondents for their degree of support or opposition to any of the proposed changes. And then also importantly, why or why not. It's not just enough to say I support or I oppose, but we need to understand why. And so for any organization that might support some sort of alternative approach within the Scope 2 inventory framework, and I'm going to separate the answer across both consultations here. If it's an alternative approach that is within the Scope 2 inventory framework, the best way to share feedback where a different approach is preferred, or at least not this is someone's answer, is to focus on those questions that ask for reasons for not supporting a specific proposed revision and what the underlying reason or rationale for preferring a different approach is. So as an example, several of the questions on hourly matching and exemptions were directly inviting respondents to explain why they might prefer a different approach and what criterion they would use under those different approaches, and critically, what evidence supports that different pathway. So there's a handful, I think, in every single section, open-ended questions, open-ended areas where respondents are encouraged to describe any alternative ideas, any rationale related with those ideas. But again, designing the consultation to ensure that we have this in a structured and consistent format. So also want to highlight some of the alternative positions that we hear, sort of just paying attention to the community around us. Approaches related to things like SMEs, small, medium enterprises, temporary exemptions, phase-in options, et cetera. These are things that the TWG raised, the ISB understood, the ISB reviewed and said, yes, we do want to incorporate this into the consultation. And those questions, those considerations are directly asked and explored through the consultation. And so we're getting people's direct feedback on some of those alternative positions that the ISB reviewed and said, yes, we really want to focus, see if we can integrate some of this. If we look at some of the other topics, some of the areas of interest that we know are out there, consequential methods, avoided emissions, procurements, et cetera, these are being addressed separately from the Scope 2 consultation. They're evaluated through the consequential consultation, not the Scope 2 inventory consultation. So any feedback related to those approaches, avoided emissions, procurement emissions, consequential methodologies at large, that's really what we're looking to collect and gather information through our parallel consultation on consequential measures. And then there's, I think, also another category here. There's alternatives that we were raised during our technical working group discussions. These considerations did not receive sufficient support through the technical working group to advance into formal proposals. They did not receive support from the Independent Standards Board. These have all been transparently cataloged for reference. They're available through our document repository. And this current consultation is focused reflecting the set of revisions that have been endorsed for public consultation through the GHG protocol's governance process. So hopefully that provides kind of some direction, some guidance of whether you're aligning, whether you're swinging in a different direction, where and how to focus some of that feedback. And again, differentiating across, is this Scope 2 inventory feedback, is this consequential method feedback, really using both of those channels to ensure the information is provided in the appropriate spots. I think you said you have a separate or related question though.
Yeah, let's jump to the next question. I think you partially covered this one. Let me just flash it up on the screen for a second. So how do I respond to the survey questions if I don't support hourly and deliverability requirements when the questions only offer options on these requirements. Again, you've partially covered this, but I'll give you a chance just to cover this one more time.
Yeah, and I think we did cover this, that we're asking specific questions, we're focusing consultation on a specific proposal, but just because the questions are asking detailed about specific parameters or provisions, there are plenty of ways to provide alternative views, perspectives, and provisions. So maybe some specific examples, question 69 and 70, those let you set some default assumptions for subsequent questions related to maybe hourly matching deliverability. But if you don't support hourly matching deliverability, you could select responses. You should still select responses in question 69 and 70 so that we can understand your position in some subsequent questions. But really importantly, questions 71, 74, and 75 are specifically focused and targeted to say, if you don't support this, why? And what would you maybe prefer as an alternative? So I think there is plenty of space to say if you've got different views, if you've got different perspectives, there's clearly flagged and identified channels to provide that information. And one last point, please answer questions like question 70 with the understanding this is not an indication, do you support that parameter, that provision? There's a separate question asking that. This is just to say, how do we put the rest of your answers in context?
Gotcha. And then connected to that, you mentioned that people should respond through that survey, please. So in the survey, there's a 4,000 character limit. So are stakeholders constrained by the 4,000 character limit in certain questions, or is there a way to submit a holistic response? So again, that's just for specific questions. Certain questions have a limit of 4,000 characters. Is that basically the constraint, or is there a way to submit a holistic response beyond that?
As they say, Marcus, brevity is the soul of clarity. 4,000 characters is actually quite a bit, particularly when you recognize that that's spread out across many different questions. So every respondent, whether it's an organization or an individual, as I mentioned earlier, you have one opportunity, one consultation to provide this feedback. That's again to ensure everybody's heard equally, but once and only once type perspective, although I shouldn't have said vote because this is far from a voting exercise. That 4,000 character limit does apply, but it's on per question basis. And so as anyone who's reviewed the consultation, you see that we've really kind of broken down into core pieces, parts, and elements of each question. So there's multiple places of 4,000 characters to continue to provide specific points of feedback across all of those parameters. So if anybody's got, you want to convey maybe broader reflections, context, et cetera, there's plenty of these open-ended questions to provide additional comments. I think at the end of a lot of sections, there's a final additional comment area as well, in addition to question by question areas where 4,000 characters can be used over and over again to provide that. So that's the limit. And again, one consultation response per individual or organization.
All right. Next, then, there's different ways to answer the same question. What kind of feedback would be most helpful?
Yeah. I mean, that's really the goal of this whole process, is to provide helpful feedback and then to act and enable the outcomes based on it. So one, I would highlight the decision-making criteria and hierarchy. Encourage everybody, don't need to spend a whole lot of time with it. It's not that complex, but just think about its structure. Think about the way that it's organized, scientific integrity, and adherence to accounting principles. That has to be part of how we evaluate all these different options. We have option A, B, C. How do we compare them? Use this decision-making criteria and hierarchy. How does option A's scientific integrity compare to option B and C? Also, how does option B support ambitious climate action and programs relative to option A and C? And last, but absolutely not least, feasibility for all of these different options. So those are our sort of overly simplified 3 parameters for that. So really encourage everybody, just read that, understand it, maybe have it in the back of your mind for how you provide answers. The other piece that I would say is we all come at this from a specific angle and perspective, but recognize that we're all collectively as a community coming at this, all asking for different things here. And one of the new players in this space, something that I think, read the 2004 GHG Protocol corporate standard, it envisions the GHG protocol as being used by programs like ISSB, like FREG, like the California reporting rules, but at the time was not. Those organizations now use GHG protocol, and that does change this from a purely voluntary framework to something that also needs to support these mandatory disclosure programs. Think about how that changes the dynamic and the balance across all the different pieces and parts to this.
Got you. Then next question, you talked about feasibility and specifically the legacy clause. So for that legacy clause, what aspects are still being discussed and what aspects are settled already within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol?
Yeah, fantastic question. And like I said earlier, legacy clause is something we really want to call people's attention to, focus, and get as much structured, intelligent feedback as we possibly can here. So the draft outlines potential approaches for how, and we all know we've all come up with many examples here of existing market-based instrument contracts, power purchase agreements. How do we recognize and accommodate these during some sort of transition period if these proposed provisions are adopted? So critically, the ISB's deliberations, as well as input from the observing entities, recognize there's an incredibly a complex set of trade-offs here involving balancing continuity for existing contracts, protecting early action, honoring these investments, but also strengthening the comparability and the reporting integrity. That's not an easy set of things to balance. And so we really want to note that these, and maybe just to step back for a second, when we think about legacy clause, if you have contracts that are supplying electricity directly for use by the reporting entity, physical power purchase agreement, you're taking ownership of the physical power and the buyer's taking, again, that ownership of power within the same market, this might not necessarily even be relevant for you. You can still account for it, you can still use that in those situations. The legacy clause really is focused primarily for those contracts, instruments where there's no physical offtake of the power. This is purely a financial or maybe virtual arrangement, separate from any contract where there's actual physical supply of power. But we want to reflect these trade-offs. So there's two primary options. One of them applies sort of a legacy clause, essentially grandfathers, if you will, contractual instruments under these current quality criteria for some for organizations to use. Another option that would say require all of these instruments, both new and existing, at some defined transition date to flip over and everything uses the same standard. Those two options optimize different outcomes. One of them is protecting early actions, early investments, honoring corporate commitments. The other one is emphasizing the need for comparable data under financial disclosure frameworks. How do we do both well? That's what we're looking for everybody's feedback through this consultation process.
Thank you. And I know we're running up against time. For everyone who has to jump, we'll finish these questions here. Just know we'll have a recording of this webinar. We'll make it public available. So just know if you have to jump, no worries. You will see the rest of the questions at the end of the video. With that, another question on the legacy clause. Can a decision be made on the legacy clause earlier than 2027?
So I'll start by saying I'm not the person who has the authority to answer that question. That's Independent Standards Board, ISB. They're the organization, they're the entity as part of this process who is responsible for any and all final decisions here, including Scope 2 standard and including anything on the legacy clause. Our role as the Secretariat is really facilitating this consultation, facilitating the process, and to help provide both the ISB and the observing entities with clear sort of representative synthesis of this. But if we look at the published timeline for Scope 2, we have under Phase 1, our goal is to provide clarity resolution on this topic by mid next year, mid 2026. That's where Phase 1 is seeking to provide these updates on. That's going to follow analysis of all of this consultation feedback, engagement with Secretariat and the TWG, as well as presentation to the ISB on the deliberations. So we're targeting mid next year, mid 2026 to provide an answer to this question. But I also want to just make sure everybody understands the context of what do we have to do to get to the answer. So that timing does remain subject to both the work to synthesize the feedback, as well as then this decision rests with the Independent Standards Board. I will not purport to speak on their behalf, but we all understand that completing this work on these Phase 1 topics is that critical steps towards providing a revised text on key requirements to align with and hit those published Scope 2 timeline targets. So again, cannot underemphasize how important of a topic this is for these contracts. And I'll say it one last time and stop belaboring it, but please, 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 everybody really engage with this. And again, this is an area where both tell us what your thoughts are, but please take time to really comprehensively think through what the other perspectives are here and help us understand how to respond to all of the perspectives asking for different outcomes. That's really the most helpful way to help shape the outcome of this process and ensure we get a balanced outcome.
All right, and then the last three questions are a bit broader. One is about the consequential method. So project accounting guidance already exists, but it is not widely used by companies procuring clean energy. If the consequential methods metric being developed will also live outside of corporate inventories, how do you see it being more widely used and recognized than it is currently?
Yeah, and actually this is an incredibly well-timed question. This week, the Actions Market Instruments that AMI TWG is holding a multi-day, all-day long workshop, and that workshop is designed to support and accelerate development of this new framework that I've mentioned several times for reporting all kinds and types of climate impacts related to different actions, market instruments, et cetera. And that includes things like clean energy procurement, other interventions, and in that context, often extends beyond an organization's direct inventory boundaries. And so you're right, traditional project accounting has been underutilized. We've heard this and appreciate it. I think there's broad agreement on that perspective. But unlike traditional project accounting, what you would download from G2 Protocol's existing project accounting standards, AMI is designing something different. They're here to provide standardized corporate level approaches that complements inventories. They're here to make it easier for companies to disclose both an inventory and an impact metric within a single comprehensive and connected system. I don't know if it's been shared with CEBA members, but would highlight there's a draft white paper out now available on our document repository. This draft AMI white paper outlines this framework. I would encourage anybody interested to go review that white paper. As I mentioned, there's also this technical working group workshop that's happening right now. That workshop's focused on refining, building alignment across the technical working group of that draft white paper. That will then be refined put for the ISB and really help steer and shape some of the next steps on this topic. We're also going to publish a blog, I think, in the next few days to really describe more information about the Actions Market Instruments work and how it's doing something more than just simply saying, everybody go out and use consequential methods. It's a lot more than that. We're really targeting to have a significantly more transparent and a more credible recognition framework for these impact-based outcomes, but simultaneously maintaining the integrity of inventory accounting under the Scope 1, 2, and 3 standards.
Gotcha. Another question on impact. What options for impacts are open to a company with load within a market boundary with very limited or no clean energy procurement options?
And I think this goes back to a couple different points made so far is as we look at these inventory updates, aligning with the definition Scope 2, purchase and consumed electricity, the evolving role of G2 protocol in the broader ecosystem, including use by mandatory disclosure programs, climate-related financial disclosures, et cetera. That's the context that we need to think about this, but also with the Actions Market Instruments standing right alongside a Scope 2 inventory. So if we say Scope 2 inventory, that's designed to reflect a company's reported outcomes based on what it can purchase and consume within its deliverable market boundary. And so Marcus, is you asking your question, if there's limited clean energy options, there's scarce procurement options in a given region, a Scope 2 inventory is going to show that reality, what's available for purchase and consumption. And I think we can then immediately acknowledge, if that's the answer, that this is only one part of a much more broad, comprehensive climate action toolbox. The ISB also recognized this. We described this in our Scope 2 decision blog related to the ISB's decision from July. ISB clearly directed future work, ensuring alignment with the AMI workstream. And so when you talk about impact beyond the inventory, beyond what an organization can purchase and consume, that's where AMI's role is so critical. Their focus, their development of this sector agnostic framework, developing reporting framework, capture these impacts, actions like enabling clean energy supply. Maybe it's not in your region. Maybe it's in some area where that's really restrictive and hard to do. But organizations can go beyond that and develop clean energy supply. They can support system upgrades. Maybe they even support transmission development or other kinds and types of actions, but they're not directly reflected in what an organization procures and uses. And so these revisions are really seeking to help ensure and enable that we have fit for purpose reporting tools, recognize inventory as inventory, and separately but alongside impacts associated with all of these broader actions using the right and disaggregated reporting methods. And so that's really the sort of larger, broader, comprehensive framework that's being pursued through all of the GHG protocol updates, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, actions, market instruments.
Gotcha. The last question we have is regarding the market-based method. If my organization has a net zero goal to make claims under the market-based method, so that's the part I would be changing, right? Will I need to change my procurement strategy?
Yeah. I think maybe an important starting point here, GHG Protocol's role in this ecosystem. GHG Protocol is here to provide the accounting and reporting standards. Other bodies develop target setting frameworks, certification programs, mandatory disclosures, et cetera. GHG Protocol's role here is we need to have methods that ensure accurate, consistent, transparent emission measurements. And then other programs can combine them, ask for them separately, subtract A from B, whatever it is that they're seeking to achieve, and put that into their framework, which is going to define the goals, the rules, and the claims. Our Scope 2 revisions are really focused on improving the integrity and the comparability of market-based method, trying to increase and strengthen this alignment between when and where clean energy is generated and used. And so this does mean that for some existing procurement arrangements, those might no longer result in zero market-based emissions. But the underlying accounting framework is seeking to remain neutral towards any business choice, any procurement strategies, any options. And that's really an organizational level decision for them to either maintain specific reporting outcomes, how they set their public targets, et cetera. But again, emphasize these revisions don't necessarily require companies to make procurement decisions. It's just simply the accounting framework underneath. The other piece that I think is an important consideration to bring into this question, this conversation, is as part of these envisioned updates and with that phased implementation, all of the updates across the entire corporate standard suite are going to take effect on a coordinated timeline. So one, that means action market instruments resources will be available in addition to and alongside changes to the corporate suite, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. But it also means every organization using GHG protocol standards, every program based on it, will also be assessing and adapting these updates at the same time. And so that means it's not just one organization who's saying we need to revise, revisit, reconsider, think about anything that we're doing. It's every organization using this simultaneously. And so there's really sort of a level playing field that everybody would bump into in a transition period as updates happen to corporate standard related to consolidation, operational, organizational boundaries, requirements to report Scope 3, changes in Scope 2, modifications across that entire suite of the corporate standard. So critically, this is not a one organization in isolation. This is all of us moving forward together in the ecosystem. Let me wrap with that.
Thanks, Michael. With that, I'll quickly walk us through the next slide before I let Misti and Michael close us out. So first of all, this was a lot of content. There's a lot of things that are in people's heads, I imagine, as they're going through the surveys. I want to just say that we have a couple of resources we want to make available for members and the public also. So one is, I can just highlight this quickly. We have a toolkit. We prepared a publicly available toolkit. You see the links in the chat. That's available for everyone. That's a 14-page PDF where you just give a guide how to answer these questions, like basically what the survey is about and what you need to know for answering them. One is we have a bi-weekly office hour for CEBA members. So every other week, next time, by the way, on November 19, we have a chat where everyone can just come in and ask the simple questions and get answers from us and from other colleagues. And lastly, we'll do another, CEBA will do another webinar in late November with more specifics about how, basically more of a guide from CEBA about the consultation and what our feedback would be. That's got the highlights from our side. I just want to flag too, like we have 3 webinars that are available on YouTube, 2 from us, from CEBA. I'll see that you see them on the right, and 1 from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. One is about basically, I mean, let me cut it there, like just high level overview of what's happening in the greenhouse gas accounting space. With that, I'll hand it back to Misty to close us out together with Michael.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody else who hung on an extra 15 minutes to go through that. I think we could spend another hour perhaps. And Michael, thank you so much. If there are additional procedural questions, what's the best way for folks to ask that to the Secretariat or the protocol? Is there an online form? I'm just thinking this may have raised some other sort of questions that we didn't anticipate. What's the best way for stakeholders to engage on sort of procedural questions?
I believe, let me double check. There should be information available on the consultation website that provides just a whole bunch of information. So before you click send that email, review all of that, and let me double check if there's a link. We do have a contact us form also on the GHG Protocol website, and that would be, that remains always the default option, that if people have questions, and it goes through a process to sort and ensure the right people see the question. So if there's something as a default, there's the contact us form, and there may be additional information provided on the consultation site. But again, read everything first and then
Good recommendation. Amazing recommendation. Good. There are a lot of materials on the website. Please go there. Okay, thank you. We're going to close this out. We'll make this recording available. And again, thank you to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and Michael for your extensive presentation. And look forward to all stakeholders engaging in these 2 public consultations.